Welcome to this Thursday edition of Inside India. I'm Sri Jegarajah. Here are your headlines. The Fed warns of increasing uncertainty about the economic outlook amid Trump's trade war as it kept rates on hold for a third straight time. The United States may be close to inking its first trade deal since Trump unleashed his tariff war. The New York Times reporting President Trump could announce a deal with the UK as soon as today. And Pakistan pledging to retaliate after India's strikes on the country on Tuesday. A lot of questions if this is an escalation the two nuclear-armed neighbours can afford. We will hear from the chairman of India's Committee on External Affairs, Shashi Tharoor, who was also a former United Nations Under-Secretary, and also get analysis from Eurasia Group. Indian markets join us in about 45 minutes' time. GIFT Nifty futures are indicating an opening number in the region of 24,441. So again, it looks like at the open that the story is going to be one of relative resilience despite these renewed Indo-Pakistan tensions. Many are saying that this is the worst it has ever been since, in terms of hostilities, cross-border hostilities in around 20 years. But the Indian market seems to be relatively impervious to all of this. Let's take a look at the broader Asian markets as well. And we are seeing something of a mixed picture, resiliency there too, but there is some weakness, just fractional weakness in Southeast Asia. The Federal Reserve leaving its key interest rates unchanged overnight as widely expected for a third meeting in a row. Fed Chair Jerome Powell noted that the economy remains healthy, but tariffs could start challenging the dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices. And for now, they can afford to be patient as they wait to see the full impact of Trump's tariff policies.
I don't think we can say, which way this will shake out. I think there's a great deal of uncertainty about, for example, where tariff policies are going to settle out, and also when they do settle out, what will be the implications for the economy, for growth, and for employment. I think it's too early to know that. So, ultimately, we think our policy rate is in a good place to stay as we await further clarity on tariffs and ultimately their implications for the economy.
And as a result of that position from the Fed, the dollar is repricing to a certain degree. Dollar gaining back some ground after that Fed decision. Currently, the dollar index standing at 99.68. Now, US President Trump will be holding a news conference tonight on Thursday about a major trade deal, the first from the US since his tariff rampage began. New York Times is reporting that the deal could be with the United Kingdom, and it could come as soon as today. We have seen some strengthening in pound sterling as a result of that. So this is how cable is stacking up at 133.44. Remember, the UK also signed a trade deal with India this week, with both sides agreeing to increase bilateral trade and to lower tariffs. And that's another explanation as to why the Indian markets, the Indian benchmarks like the Sensex and the Nifty 50 have been resilient despite this latest round of Indo-Pak tensions. On the China front, Chinese Vice Premier He Lufeng and US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will meet in Switzerland this weekend. Ahead of that, President Trump saying he's not thinking about lowering tariffs on China.
We were losing $1 trillion a year. Now we're not losing anything, That's the way I look at it. We were losing with China on trade $1 trillion a year. More, actually. 1.1, but let's say $1 trillion. You know what we're losing now? Nothing. That's not bad.
Mr. President, China says in order to have substantive negotiations, you have to bring down your 145% tariffs. Are you open to pulling back your tariffs in order to get China to the negotiating table?
No.
Unequivocal there from President Trump, who also offered to mediate between India and Pakistan amid rising tensions. And the Karachi Stock Exchange, and important to look at this through the lens of the financial markets and the broader macro picture, as we must, closed 3% lower on Wednesday after India carried out targeted strikes, Operation Sindoor, across the border in Pakistan and Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. Country's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif vowing to retaliate.
गुज़श्ता रात The previous night, India made an offensive mistake, and it will have to bear the repercussions of its actions. Perhaps they thought we would retreat, but they forgot that, by the grace of Allah Almighty, we are a nation of brave people who are steely in their determination.
Prime Minister Sharif also claimed Pakistan had shot down 5 Indian fighter jets, New Delhi not confirming this yet. In the meantime, Islamabad saw rallies in support of the army as a tit-for-tat breaks out. And on the economic front, the International Monetary Fund is set to review its funding to the country, to Pakistan, tomorrow. Back in India, civil defence mock drills were conducted all across the country. India also released videos of the targets hit while maintaining that it was non-escalatory and did not target civilians. In a press conference, India's Ministry of Defence explained why the targets were chosen. Right, let's bring in CNBC TV18's Parakshit Luthra, who's following the developments in the Indian capital, in New Delhi. Parakshit, thank you for joining me. What are you hearing from your government sources about escalation risk, and what are the chances that Pakistan could hit targets beyond Kashmir?
Nothing is off the table. The ball clearly now is in Pakistan's court. India has made it very clear, and that briefing by the Foreign Secretary of India, Vikram Misri, and also briefings and announcements by Rajnath Singh, the Defence Minister, made it aptly clear that India was only targeting terror camps in Pakistan. We did not want to target civilians or any economic or army installation. But we cannot control the response of Pakistan. We have seen Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif addressing the nation. He said that India has made a grave mistake. They have killed Pakistani civilians, and Pakistan will take revenge. And they back Asif Munir and other top leaders of the Pakistani Defence Forces. So there is going to be a response, but we have to see how much does Pakistan want to escalate now. India has made it very clear that their action was very limited to those 9 terror camps. We're looking at tensions simmering since last night. Very heavy artillery shelling by Pakistan all across the line of control and the international border. At least 15 civilians have been killed. We're hearing of blackout drills being carried out all across the border in airports like Amritsar, and civilians were asked to also take shelter during that blackout as well. There are some air raid sirens going off in Pakistani side. Lots of reports coming in, but we are waiting for certain official confirmations from the Indian government.
Parakshit, this also comes at a time when India is trying to get a trade deal with the United States. We've been hearing a lot about a deal by Diwali. What updates do you have on that front? And to what degree, if national security is of the utmost importance now, to what degree is that pushing back those negotiations as a priority?
Well, India is very keen to make sure that the trade agenda, the FTA agenda, remains on track. We see this as an opportunity, a period where India can rise up as an alternative to China, as a place where people can come and invest and manufacture as an alternative. US definitely sees India as a destination. Considering that Piyush Goyal, the Commerce Minister, visited the UK to get this deal done almost twice in a span of 7 days, just shows the intent of the government. Speaking about the trade deal with the United States, we hear from sources that the Indian government is offering almost zero tariffs on all product lines except for wheat, maize, rice, and dairy. Now, these are red lines as far as Indian farmers and the Indian government go. The US, on the other side, wants to impose a 10% tariff on Indian imports into the United States. India is still pushing for zero. Let's see what happens. What we hear from sources on both sides, that talks are progressing well on the tariff part or the goods trade part of the negotiations, but there are still a lot of differences on non-tariff barriers. The US government has submitted a list of 67 or 70 non-tariff barriers, unfair treatment banks, American companies, with regard to taxation here in India. So we have to see what happens on that front. Piyush Goyal is visiting the United States on the 19th of this month for further negotiations.
Pramit, and needless to say, defence is going to be a cornerstone of the US-India bilateral deal. Thank you very much indeed for that. Pramit Chowdhury there. Pardon me. Let's bring in Pramit Chowdhury now, the practice head, South Asia at Eurasia Group. Pramit, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Pakistan's Prime Minister has said, we will exact revenge for every drop of Pakistani blood. India expects further attacks from Pakistan and appears to be preparing the civilian population for worst. You heard that report from my colleague Parakshit. The military conflict appears to be far from over.
My sense is that the present tit-for-tat that's been going on between the two is basically either about to wind down or is over already. I read Shahbaz Sharif's speech in a slightly different way. I think he sort of declared victory. We shot down X number of Indian fighter aircraft. We repelled a major Indian attack, so we're ahead here. Yes, there will be retaliation. He kind of has to say that, but he also didn't say that the retaliation would necessarily be in the form of airstrikes or missile strikes. There are other options for Pakistan, and they've used them before. And he did emphasize, or his ministers have emphasized, at a time and place of our choosing. It is possible that Pakistan may carry out one last round of symbolic strikes, as they did when India and Pakistan went head-to-head in 2019. They just hit barren ground at that point, just to show that they could do it. And it's possible that may happen. But my sense is that if there was going to be an attack like this, it should have happened last night. And now both international pressure and just the sort of calm that's taken place would make it increasingly unlikely that the kind of kinetic war that we've just seen over the past 48 hours would take place.
Both sides need to step back and both sides need to declare or claim victory. What exactly constitutes that victory and therefore constitutes a face-saving climb down from these very potentially disastrous set of tensions that we're facing now is open to question. From India's perspective, Pramit, the initial strikes, Operation Sindoor, if it has degraded what New Delhi describes as terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan-administered Kashmir and Pakistan itself, is that enough for India to step back?
Well, I think there are three elements to what India has done or will be doing. One is that they've carried out attacks in inhabited areas. Traditionally, India's only hit terrorist camps in remote areas to avoid civilian casualties. In this case, they had to hit the headquarters of two of the major terrorist organizations, Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is something they've never done before. And they basically indicated, we don't care about civilian casualties anymore, since you have targeted Indian civilians in the terror attack in April. Second, they're no longer hitting Pakistani Kashmir, under which India could make a sort of vague argument that this is Indian territory occupied by Pakistan, does not constitute an act of war. In this case, they attacked all over Pakistan. It was basically a lot of territory that was not under dispute. So you've taken two major red lines on this point, including deep into Punjab and Bahawalpur, for example. Third, and I think this is going to be the important thing, India's indicated it will now take the conflict or the rivalry into economic areas. The suspension of the Indus Rivers Treaty is probably the most important, because that is going to be a year-long or two-year-long policy of slowly working to divert or block water into Pakistan from the three rivers that basically provide 80% of Pakistan's water.
I wanted to pursue that tangent with you, Pramit. And for Pakistan and for India, how politicized has the IMF loan program and the loan review, which in the light of these hostilities becomes far more sharper? The loan review is up tomorrow, May the 9th, and there are reports that India is putting pressure on the International Monetary Fund to review or, read between the lines, rescind or not disperse loans to Pakistan because of its actions. This is almost, if it is material, this is tantamount to some sort of sanctioning on Pakistan. Do you think that will happen?
I think India may try to delay that process, but India simply doesn't have the votes right now unless the United States or some major Western country joins in, because India, if I'm correct, only has less than 2% of vote share. So it doesn't have that capacity. Unless India has found should we say, an administrative or bureaucratic procedural matter by which they can go into some bylaw and say this can be delayed. But even then, India can only delay. It cannot stop the IMF. But it has signaled, in effect, that we are now prepared to use this as an instrument of leverage against Pakistan, which interesting because India has never done that before. But at present, it's largely symbolic.
The objective economic reality, Pramit, and we saw this writ large with the way that the benchmark Pakistani stock index, the KSE, reacted yesterday compared to what the Indian benchmarks did in the wake of Operation Sindoor. Pakistan cannot finance a prolonged conflict with India on borrowed money and with the economy in tatters because it will simply push it to the brink of another sovereign debt default. Is that going to be enough to pull Pakistan back?
I'm assuming that's in Pakistan's calculations as to why they're holding back right now, because, as you've said, they have 16, not just the stock exchange, they have $16 billion in foreign exchange right now. They're trying desperately to attract foreign direct investment, big investments from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. They've been trying very hard. That's not going to happen, obviously, if they're having a major security problem. Not just with India, they're also in a quasi war with Afghanistan. So I think for them that makes. India, on the other hand, is, I think, close to $690 billion worth of foreign exchange right now. So the mismatch is enormous. But I think what is going to be happening over the next year is that India has concluded internally that just carrying out these military strikes in Pakistan really doesn't have any lasting impact. It gets a couple of years of peace, and then after that, the two sides India starts to experience terrorist activity that they believe comes from Pakistan. So what we need to be doing is imposing something much harsher in Pakistan. And I think the Indus River decision is going to be particularly important. We're already seeing India experiment, shutting down, opening up sluice dams, moving water aside. And the Pakistani Indus Rivers Commission has already issued a report that, like, the one river, the Chenab, is already 20% lower than they had expected. And they're expecting about a 7% hit in their agricultural crop right now.
Yes.
That's minor because right now it's glacial melt, so nobody can actually block that water. In the winter time, however, there is a shortage of water in all the rivers. And if India then diverts even, let's say, 10% of that river water, that would be devastating for the winter crop of Pakistan. We'll see how that unfolds over the months, whether India even has the political will to go that far. But the willingness of India now to consider long-term economic damage to Pakistan as an acceptable form of conflict is going to be a game changer in my view.
What role do you think China has to play here, Pramit, if the worst does materialise? China is very clear about its relationship with Pakistan. It describes it as an iron brother. If the worst does come to the worst, is China going to back Pakistan financially, militarily, perhaps, or is that a bridge too far?
Financially, to some degree, yes, though the Chinese have not been very helpful to the Pakistanis in the past 2 years in the worst financial crisis in Pakistan's history. Basically said, just go to the IMF, don't come to us. But in the past, when India and Pakistan have clashed, China has gone as far as mobilizing soldiers up and down the Indian border, but it has never intervened militarily. Even in the 2019 clash, China basically said, you're both there. Why don't you just settle it between yourselves? And yesterday, the Chinese embassy in Delhi, their Twitter account, they said that you're both our neighbors. Please de-escalate, be calm, don't take this any further, which was a very neutral statement for a country that, as you mentioned, is the ironclad brother of Pakistan and has a very hostile relationship with India. But keep in mind that right now, over the past 20 months, China has been signaling to India, we wish to normalize a relationship. Wang Yi has called upon a dragon-elephant dance to maintain the stability of the international system, because for China, it is the United States and Donald Trump who is by far their biggest concern.
Interesting. Pramit, for both countries, if the upshot of all of this is an outbreak of hostilities and a greater defence spending, and let's not forget that this is a narrative globally from Europe to China rearmament, then does that, for India and Pakistan, does it derail the narrative of fiscal consolidation and fiscal discipline for both of these sovereigns? And ultimately, are the ratings agencies and the bond markets going to have something to say about that?
Interesting question. Pakistan's already announced an 18% increase in their defense budget starting next fiscal year. That alone will massively damage their IMF program. I'd like to see how the IMF absorbs that. I mean, it's still not going to happen for another fiscal year, but that's an enormous increase. India has not announced anything yet. India's defense budget is already about 10 times Pakistan's. And if this is merged at the same time with a reduction of tensions with China, which is the primary strategic opponent of India, then India probably won't have to do more than just rebuild some of its arsenal in terms of missiles and so on. Modi is not a big spender on military. If you look at the Indian defense budget as a percentage of GDP, it has been halved over the past 10 years since Modi's come to power. But in absolute terms, it has risen, and this is, I think, the core of it. India, because it can attain 6 to 6.5% growth a year, it can keep increasing its defense expenditure without affecting its fiscal consolidation position.
Pramit, and it's an interesting point, isn't it? Do you feel that defense is going to be a central component of a US-India bilateral trade deal? We've heard a lot about this. J.D. Vance has been talking about it, and I do believe Secretary Hegseth is the next ranking Trump administration official to visit India. President Trump himself may be visiting India to redefine the Quad security alliance. Inevitably, given US-India relations are so tight and are getting tighter, India's going to have to increase its commitments to buy more US F-35s and especially leading-edge AI-enabled defense equipment.
Yeah, I think there are two elements to this. One is India until now has avoided buying offensive platforms from the United States. In other words, India's warships, aircraft, tanks come from other countries, mainly France and Russia. But the Russian relationship is fraying, partly because India will not accept any weapons which have Chinese components, which Russia increasingly cannot avoid. We've never bought an offensive platform because a lot of the equipment that America provides can only be given to treaty allies. India is not a treaty ally of the United States. Trump indicated at his summit meeting in Modi that he's going to change that. He's going to exempt India from that rule. We'll see if that happens. Trump, what he says and what actually happens on the ground can often be very, very different. But yes, on the strategic technology side, everything, and I've met a number of Trump officials in India, have been flying in and out, and they're very clear. We have a new compact between the two of us. It's going to be trade, technology, and security. Just settled the bilateral trade agreement at the president's request. And then the technology and the military side of it will take off on a completely higher plane than any previous U.S. administration. That's been what they're signaling. And at the heart of it is going to be supply chain integration on a whole host of strategic technologies that they want to work together with India. And it's interesting that they have exempted India from Trump's insistence that everything must be manufactured in America. They have said we will jointly manufacture semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, invest together in AI, quantum computing. Vance's speech in India was almost the reverse of his Munich Security Conference speech. India is America's future partner. India has what everything Europe doesn't.
Pramit, fantastic insight, sir. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today. Pramit Chowdhury there from Eurasia Group. Now we will talk more about the conflict from an Indian perspective. Shashi Tharoor, member of the Indian Parliament and chairman of the Committee on External Affairs, former UN Undersecretary, joins me next after the break. Welcome back to Inside India. Let's continue to pursue this conversation over this latest round of Indo-Pakistan tensions. And I'm delighted to say that Shashi Tharoor is joining us now, a member of the Indian Parliament and from the opposition Congress Party, is chairperson as well of the country's Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Sir, welcome to Inside India and thank you for joining me. Writing in Time magazine, Michael Kugelman has said India and Pakistan are arguably closer to war than at any time in recent years. Would you agree with that, or do you feel that there is a diplomatic off-ramp towards de-escalating?
No, I believe the latter rather than the former, because India has really chosen a very calculated, careful and calibrated approach to the response to the awful terror attacks. It was very clear that the terrorists couldn't just walk in and kill 26 Indian civilians with impunity. Some punitive action had to be taken in order to convey that there would be a price to pay for what they had done. But at the same time, India did it in an incredibly sensitive manner. That is, that they hit well-known terror establishments, headquarters of the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, organizations that have been proscribed by the United Nations Security Council and by many governments as terrorist organizations based in Pakistan. But they chose to do so at 1 o'clock in the morning, 1:05 to 1:30 in the morning, when there were not likely to be any civilians wandering about in order to minimize civilian damage, collateral damage. The idea being very clearly that we were not in the business of killing people, unlike the terrorists. We were trying to dismantle their infrastructure. Secondly, India went out of its way, even though it is amply clear that the people behind the terrorism are indeed malign elements in the Pakistani military. Nonetheless, India took care not to attack or touch any Pakistani military installations or government installations. The signal very clearly was this is not the opening salvo in a protracted war. This is a one-off retaliation for an outrageous atrocity committed against our country and our people. And I think that message was very clear. there is really no justification thereafter for further escalation. If Pakistan does choose to escalate, India is, of course, ready. But I do believe that all the calls for restraint we're hearing from around the world have to be heard by Pakistan as well. They are a country in pretty bad shape with a stagnating economy, a deeply unpopular army, and not enough supplies to last a particularly long war. I think they too should understand that they're better off in claiming that honor is satisfied with their shelling across the border that has killed 15 Indian civilians since the strikes, and that they could then start dialing down. That's my view. Of course, the men in military headquarters in Rawalpindi might think differently, and in that case, we'll have to see.
Shashi, is that it then in terms of Operation Sindoor, and has it achieved its objectives? Is it mission accomplished in terms of degrading terrorist infrastructure?
Look, we have no illusions that those buildings can be built again. I mean, there's no question that the mindset that fuels terrorism is not going to disappear overnight. And I think we have to understand, therefore, that this is not a long-term solution, let alone a definitive or permanent answer to the problem we have. That, I'm afraid, is going to require other sorts of more tangible shall we say, longer-term measures. But in the short term, it has at least taught them a lesson that you don't go around killing people without paying a price for it. You have paid a price. Now, you want to kill more people, you'll pay a bigger price. It's up to you to decide what you want to do. Pakistan has bred these monsters of terrorism for far too long as an instrument of state policy. And Pakistan has to learn that there will not be an unlimited tolerance for this sort of behavior. If you look at the way in which India reacted over the years to one terrorist outrage after another, after the horrible attacks of 26/11 in Mumbai in 2008, which killed 170 civilians, what did India do? They chose the path of peace. They took diplomatic measures. They had Pakistan condemned in the UN Security Council. They had these agencies blacklisted. They put Pakistan on the grey list of the Financial Action Task Force. And they thought this might at least modify Pakistan's behavior. It didn't. When the next atrocity happened, India gave them one more chance. They invited Pakistan to participate in the investigation into the Pathankot terrorist attacks. The Pakistanis came over, their intelligence people walked into an Indian airbase, and they went back and said, oh, the Indians did it to themselves. Now, we don't kill our own people to satisfy some bizarre propaganda notion of the Pakistanis. So that was the last straw. And the next attack in Uri, the Indian government took one step up. They sent a squad across the line of control, the de facto border, to attack a base from which this attack had happened. Next attack, Pulwama, 40 Indian soldiers killed. They went one step further still. They conducted an airstrike on Balakot. Now, the next major attack, 26 civilians killed, and with a far more malign intention of undermining tourism in Kashmir, destroying the Kashmiri economy, and creating problems in Kashmir, we decided at this point to take one step further more and hit 9 strikes. So the escalation has been very steady and gradual over a couple of decades. But Pakistan is left in no doubt that the next atrocity will involve an even bigger reprisal and so on.
Shashi,
so all is in their court. They have to choose.
That said, do you feel that this latest outbreak of hostilities is different this time? You've drawn the parallel with Mumbai in 2008. Civilians were targeted and killed in Pahalgam. It feels like India is preparing its public for a worst-case scenario and a prolonged conflict. Blackout drills, civil defence exercises implemented in many major cities, especially in the north and the northeast. Is there a chance and is there a risk that Pakistan could strike targets beyond Indian-administered Kashmir?
Well, look, I mean, that's obviously a choice that the Pakistanis have to make. We are not interested in prolonging the conflict. India has been a status quo power for a very long time. We want to focus on the growth of our economy, on our own technological future, on the well-being and prosperity of our people. We have no interest in war. It is Pakistan that wants to upset the long-standing relationships in the subcontinent in order to seize territory in Kashmir for themselves. They are a military state. I've often remarked, paraphrasing Voltaire on the Holy Roman Empire, that this is not a state with an army. This is not a state with an army. It's an army with a state, and that's the problem we have in dealing with Pakistan. Paraphrasing Voltaire on Prussia is what I meant to say. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the situation we have depends entirely on whether Pakistan wants to grow in peace in this neighborhood or whether the army believes its best prospects for dominating Pakistan, for controlling a disproportionate share of that country's resources. The Pakistani army already controls a larger percentage of that country's GDP than any army controls of any country's GDP in the world. And given all of that, if they want to preserve that by keeping tensions alive with India, well, India will be prepared. We are prepared. And I'm quite sure that we're prepared to give as good as we get. But that's not our preferred option. So when the countries call for restraint, we are already restrained. It's Pakistan that needs to be restrained.
So what then does a diplomatic off-ramp look like? President Trump has offered US mediation, but India has moved closer to the US. Defense defines the India-US relationship now. Pakistan has moved closer to the China orbit. How do these geostrategic shifting alliances complicate, in your opinion, proposals for a negotiated settlement?
Look, we're not looking at a mediation. Frankly, at the implied equivalence between the terrorist dispatcher and the terrorist victim is simply not acceptable. All I can say is that if the US and other countries, including China, of which Pakistan in many ways is a vassal state, wish to advise their client that they would be better off in being restrained, then I think I can say that we would welcome it. But we are not going to request any country to mediate in these matters. What we are going to do, and we have done, I'm quite sure, though I have no privy to classified conversations, I'm quite sure that we have briefed the foreign ministers and national security advisors of the key countries, particularly the countries that are permanent members of the Security Council, on what we have done, how carefully and what a calibrated action ours was, and how we have no desire to escalate it further. If they then are able to relay this to Pakistan and urge them not to escalate either, we might be able to see the off-ramp you're talking about. And the ball is very much in Pakistan's court. The belligerent rhetoric emanating from the Prime Minister, frankly, doesn't bother me very much. You can say a lot of things for domestic consumption. The decision-making power in that country rests in army headquarters in Rawalpindi, and it's what they decide that ultimately will make a difference. Yes. They clearly had hoped that they would be able to use this manufactured crisis to rally support for them as the force guaranteeing Pakistan's security and stability. If they feel they need to do some more in order to ensure that and end their rather tottering and faltering level of popularity now, they might want to try and do it again, in which case, as I said, we are ready and we will give it right back.
Absolutely. Shashi, are more economic measures on the table? We've already seen India respond decisively by cancelling the Indus Valley Water Treaty.
Not cancelling, we've only held it in abeyance. We haven't cancelled it. It's in suspension, if you like. Yeah.
I see. Of course. Thank you for that clarification. Pakistan's IMF loan review is up for discussion review tomorrow on May the 9th. There are reports that India is putting pressure on the International Monetary Fund to review or read between the lines, not disperse that latest tranche of loans. Is everything on the table now, including possible economic measures and economic sanctioning?
Well, why would the international community want to give more money to a state that spends it in financing, arming, equipping, guiding, and sending terrorists to a neighboring country? Why would it want to essentially finance a war machine by an irresponsible, feckless, and selfish military establishment? These are questions that the international community will ask itself. Yes, it's a question of refinancing an external debt. That's one thing. You're giving them money to buy fuel and supplies for their bloated military, then I think India would have a problem, and we'll convey that.
Shashi, we'll leave it there, sir. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Inside India. Shashi Tharoor there, member of the Indian Parliament, Lok Sabha. Coming up on the programme, we'll bring you stories from earnings to market debuts. Do stay with us. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back. You're watching Inside India. Some of the stories that we're keeping tabs on outside of India. Take a look at shares of DBS in Singapore in the green despite net profits falling 2% on year in the first quarter, its first drop in 3 years. The bank also flagged economic uncertainties due to macro risks and guided net profit this year would fall compared to last year. Now, CNBC will be speaking to DBS CEO in the next hour. And US President Donald Trump says there could be a new proposal for a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. This as Israel continues its aid blockade on the Gaza Strip. The World Central Kitchen announcing it's had to stop work in the enclave as it's run out of supplies. European Union renewing its calls overnight, urging Israel to allow aid to reach those in need. And Chinese tea chain Auntie Jenny jumping in its market debut on the Hong Kong Exchange. This is the third bubble tea stock to list in Hong Kong this year after Mixu and Gumming. Right, India's markets will be joining us soon. We'll take you through the action after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. And now, despite this vicious outbreak of hostilities across the Indo-Pakistan border and the line of control, the Indian markets have been relatively resilient, all things considered. They're coming online, and once again, the story is one of resilience and defending that 24,400 line for the Nifty 50 in the benchmark. However, we have been seeing some weakness in the Indian rupee, but even that story is starting to stabilise and come back to a degree. US dollar under some pressure, so the flip side here is that Indian rupee is consolidating around this level of 84.57. Let's take a look now at some of the movers in the Indian markets today. We are watching shares of Indian auto major Tata Motors, which is having a strong session at the get-go, up by almost 3%. This is after India and the UK sealed a free trade agreement which could bring down the prices of SUVs by as much as 50% in India. In the meantime, Tata Motors shareholders have approved plans to split the automaker into two listed companies, separating its passenger and commercial vehicle arms. Let's also take a look at defence stocks, as we must, listed in Mumbai, and how they are reacting to developments on the India-Pakistan front. All of them in positive territory. Most of these stocks did see some profit taking yesterday. Let's talk about investing in India in these volatile times. Ashutosh Sharma is with us now, Head of India Investments and M&A at Process. First of all, Ashutosh, just give us a sense of how public-private markets and business confidence and sentiment are likely to hold up, given we have a new brick in the wall of worry for the Indian markets and these renewed India-Pakistan tensions.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me here. We at Process take a very long-term view on countries and opportunities and companies that we invest in. And I think that's a sentiment shared by many investors in India. And that's why, as you highlighted, the public markets have been very, very resilient. And the underlying theme is one of India being a large and fast-growing economy, perhaps the fastest growing economy amongst the top economies of the world. And there's no denying that the country is going to add a few $1 trillion of GDP over the next 5-6 years. There's no denying that that GDP is going to translate in a few $1 trillion of market cap. And therefore, investors who are long-term in their view or horizon will look at that and discount the local minima or local dislocations, as we see very frequently happening in today's world.
Ashutosh, let's talk about your investments in Byju's, an urban company. Byju's having its fair share and struggling with corporate governance issues. Urban company coming to the market soon. Just give us your overview and your take and how you're approaching both of those names.
Absolutely. Look, we've been a backer of internet companies in India for a very long time. It's been more than 14, 15 years now. We were investors in Flipkart in the Internet 1.0 season of tech investing in India. Then we were investors in Make My Trip, and then Swiggy, Meesho, Urban Company, and so on and so forth. I think what we are seeing in India across the board is a movement from offline to online, a movement from unorganized to organized. And that's not just backed by us as investors, but it's backed by the government of India, which has developed probably the world's best digital public infrastructure in Aadhaar, in UPI, and so on and so forth. And so we are very, very bullish, very long in the Indian technology sector. As for specific names, yes, Urban Company, you would have seen that they have flipped their prospectus public. So good luck to them. And we will continue to be a long-term holder of that stock for sure. Byju, of course, has seen some trouble. And the matter is sub judice, so I'm not allowed to comment quite deeply on that matter, actually.
Ashutosh, Ather Energy came to market earlier on this week, and it was somewhat bumpy. But do you feel that the long-term story and the size of the addressable EV two-wheeler market is just hard to ignore for investors?
Yeah, I think if you were to take a leaf out of the China book, if I were to sort of go to China, the EV proliferation is top of the world. And I think India shares many such structural phenomena that are applicable in China. And therefore, long-term proliferation on penetration of EVs in India, I think will happen. Now, who wins in that construct is something that's going to play out over the next few years. But overall, as a market, EV penetration will definitely grow much, much faster than ICs.
And I understand that Prosus is planning to raise its stake and investment in the fintech startup JAR. Just give us a sense, Ashutosh, of why you are doing so and why you have conviction towards that particular name.
Look, I think it's hard to comment on specifics because some of this is under NDA. But as I said in the beginning, if India has to add $3, $4, $5, $6, $7 trillion to its GDP, the raw material to that growth is credit, is financial services. And therefore, we are very, very long on that as a sector because that's what's going to drive that growth that our country has to see over the next few years. We have in the last year itself invested in 2 financial services companies. That sector is of interest and we'll continue to invest more in that.
Do you still feel, though, that startups and the entire startup ecosystem really needs to get their house in order and perhaps are in too much of a hurry or too preoccupied to list? Earlier on, we were speaking to a guest this week who made the point that, look, let's just slow things down and really sort out the balance sheet, be fit for purpose, and sort out corporate governance before you go to market, before you publicly list. Do you have some sympathy with that?
That's all. Oh, that's always our advice, by the way, to almost all of our portfolio companies. Listing is a milestone. It's an important milestone, but it's not the end. And therefore, you should treat it like that. Secondly, the fact that now you will have to manage not 5, not 6, not 10, but thousands of shareholders. For that, you need to be in a shape. You need to be in a rhythm. You need to have the stamina to be able to do that. And so our advice almost always to our portfolio companies is start behaving like a public company before you are public. So take 3-4 quarters of that skill development on how to be a public company before you go public. And it's a milestone. And treat it like that. It's not an end game. You have to continue to beat the expectations quarter after quarter for many, many quarters for Indian investors to believe in you and trust the long-term story and be a supporter.
Ashutosh, can we just circle back to the case for fintech, which is becoming, I've got to say, a very crowded trade at the moment, arguably, and competition is intensifying, regulatory issues are intensifying. If you look at Paytm, is that giving you reason to temper your enthusiasm for that particular space?
I think the history has shown that India has the capacity and the depth to build very, very large financial services companies. If you look at the current constitution of our index, almost 40% of that is large financial services companies. These are banks, and then these are NBFCs like Bajaj Finance and so on and so forth. So yes, it is a regulated sector, and I think for good reason. And for someone who can build within those regulations there is enough tailwinds in terms of just demand for these services, just the under-penetration of these services, and tailwinds in terms of digital public infrastructure, which I talked about, by the government, that we feel that even while you're playing within that regulatory guardrail, you have an opportunity to build very, very large outcomes here.
Ashutosh, thank you very much indeed for joining me on Inside India. Ashutosh Sharma there from Process.
Thank you, sir.
That's it for today's programme. Tomorrow we will keep an eye on developments, continue to do so in the conflict between India and Pakistan. Also, we'll do a deep dive on India's rising crypto space with Coin DCX, and we'll take a look at the Indian markets with Eastspring. Don't miss that. That's all the time that we have today on Inside India. Do stay with us on the network and CNBC. Dan Murphy is up next with Access Middle East.